panel, the most important thing in this debate, the most important thing for sexual assault victims was ensuring that the assaults did not happen in the first place. It was ensuring that people were educated in a way that was informative, in a way that actually reflected the actual ways sexual assault occurred in the first place, and in a way that actually got men to cooperate with sexual assault education in a nuanced manner. First of all, setup. Second of all, why we make men more likely to cooperate. And then third of all, why we get a higher quality focus on sex education. First of all, on setup. What does it look like when we adopt the new rules narrative? First of all, it looks like a change in agenda and publicity. This means that we are focusing more on the types and ways in which sexual assault occurs in a narrative that is reflective of the nuanced nature of it. This means it is no longer just a yes or no, but rather it reflects the more nuanced nature of it. Second of all is to say that sexual assault is still condemned. This is to say that it is still a man's fault if they commit sexual assault, and that applies historically, right? Third of all is to say that we think that people can be informed by narratives. That means that societal narratives around sexual assault are narratives that means men are moreover likely to believe things when they're told things by society. Understanding this means that we can radically change the concept of what sexual assault is through changing the narratives and the way in which we address it, and recognize that this is an important issue for society. Second of all, what does willing ignorance look like? First of all, it is an understanding that it is an inherent and common sense ideology. Note here that this misses out on the nuanced nature of sexual assault and the way it occurs. Second of all, it means that men opt out of it for their own gain. That means that every man should know about this, but they still opt out. Third of all, so now onto the metric in which we think that you should judge this debate by. First of all, what is best to able to reduce sexual assault? This means what is best able to prevent future harm, therefore what is better for women in the long run. So now onto my first point, why we make it more likely that men are willing to cooperate. So first of all, why is it important for men to cooperate? First of all, the majority of sexual assaults are committed by men. This is to say that because of societal narratives, because of the way in which men have been informed about sexual assault, they're more over likely to commit it. Second of all, they enable each other. This is to say that when you tell men that they have an ignorance towards sexual assault, they are more willing to enable each other in committing it. Third of all is to say that men have a disproportionate amount of power within society. This is to say that they are typically prosecuting sexual assault. Second of all is to say that they typically set agendas around sexual assaults. Third of all is to say that they typically get higher amounts of media attention within the media. So now, second of all, why is willful ignorance making this worse? First of all, it puts men onto the defensive. This looks like men overlooking accusations of assault because they no longer see it as something that is a societal issue, but rather as something that they can just ignore. Second of all is to say that that they're less likely to adopt new narratives around sexual assault because they no longer see it as something that they have to learn about, rather something that they feel that is innate to themselves. So what this then led into was it led into men probably being more ignorant and arrogant around sexual assault education because it was no longer something that they had to be informed about, but rather something that they should just feel or just vibe with. Second of all, is it gave men a cop-out, right? Because what it meant was that they don't have to buy into sexual assault education at this point, right? That is to say that they no longer have to listen to the nuanced narratives that have the more nuance around sexual assault. Therefore, they do not have to engage. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, because men now no longer have the impetus to learn. Second of all, it's because they've been told that they have this knowledge, they just have to unlock it. So that reduces the overall willingness for them to engage. So what did this lead to? It led to men not being able to engage it led to, even for sexist men, not being able to engage in more, it led to sexist men engaging in more negative publicity around this movement. So this is to say that men who were sexist were going to engage in worse content because they were being told that they had this innate knowledge around sexual assault, therefore they are the problem when it comes to it. They were no longer willing to engage in the education which they needed to engage in because they were now no longer a product of the education or the societal narratives, but rather innately the problem. Second of all, for moderate men, it led to less sympathy for the sexual assault movement. It also led to less sympathy for women in general, but it also led to less policing or policing around it because they feel like they're put upon. If they feel like they are innately being the wrong within society when it comes to them, they no longer want to engage in the education which they see fit because they are now the harmed. Third of all is to say that this harms women to begin with, because it now looks like, first of all, it now looks like when you have a female with lots of male friends just brushing off this issue, because they can now say to their male counterpart, hey, my male friend's educated about this, he knows that sexual assault is bad, but never willing to engage in the nuanced manner of sex education or in the ways it works. And also it makes it worse in conservative societies, because in conservative societies, they're less willing to educate overall. So why is it better in our world then? Because you don't put men on the defensive. You don't put men in a position where they feel like they are the problem. Rather, you now lift them up into the movement to inform discussions, to now be able to engage meaningfully within the narratives around sexual assault in a way that also allows them to now learn in more nuanced standards. But also, it now means that men can adopt this in a way that means that the higher level of sexual assault knowledge, it's almost like a prestige mechanism, right? Because now they are seen by society as being higher. So now, second of all is to say, now into my second point, quality focus on sex education. First of all, so why don't we get quality sex education on that side of the house? First of all is to say that schools won't be able to understand that schools, when possible, do not engage in this type of education. So when they are given the narrative that men innately know about sex education, they are less willing to inform those around them, less willing to inform their students, and not engage in it well. The outcome of this is schools become more lax. It also does not, second of all, is that it does not lead to updated syllabuses. Because note here that sexual assault education on their side of the house is frozen in time. It is now something that should be innately known by men. So note here also though, that schools who do not want to engage with either side probably won't. But what we do here is for schools that are willing to engage in sexual assault education, they get higher quality. So why is it better on our side overall then? First of all, the feminist movement gets to put narratives of sexual assault into the education system. This means that you're getting much more nuanced takes on what sexual assault looks like and in the ways that it affects women. So this means that you have more open discourse. Second of all, it means that you have higher lobbying the government. Third of all, it looks like having a much better feminist movement around sexual assault and consent education. This leads to updated syllabuses on sexual assault. It also leads to narratives around sexual assault being better for women. The impact of this is that, thank you.
Cool, I think first after that speech, we're now to hop on first negative to begin the negative team's case. Here.
Day two.
I was in hospital last night.
Mark's had interesting 24 hours.
For once, it's not the UNSW contingent incubating the plague in us. Lost down. Shit.
I think it's the thing that when UNSW goes to Melbourne, they spread the plague there. And
This is just
vice versa.
retribution. I accept it.
Yeah. It's fair. F's characterization that consent is something that is new and very nuanced, that hasn't existed for a long time, is completely false, and we contest that completely. Three things in my speech: firstly, characterization; secondly, point of principle; and thirdly, how these messages are actually internalized. First, under characterization, two main questions to ask here. What does the feminist movement look like? This looks like the feminist movement has a varied membership. This looks like people from different walks of life. Secondly, they have a level of influence that is varied in different parts of the world, in different industries, which looks like maybe you have a lot of progressive movement, relatively progressive movement in Hollywood through the Me Too campaign, but not as much in other industries. Thirdly, to understand this debate, we are currently in the fourth wave of feminism, which probably started around 2012-ish, where the second wave was economic opportunity, the third wave was sexual liberation, and now the fourth wave, which is predominantly protection against sexual assault, consent, and safety. Note that this is important because if AF tells you that men's notions have changed, men's notion of consent has dramatically changed, it is completely false, and we will show you why that is completely false. And to understand that, the question to ask here is, what does this narrative actually look like? Firstly, the narrative here is that what consent actually is, and the messaging around consent is not just to do with women, but rather it's about sex and consent overall. Why is this true? Firstly, because of the info slide, it's nothing about who this consent applies to, and also it explicitly states sexual and bodily autonomy related consent. And secondly, sexual consent is just in general empirically true to be universal to all genders. It is a universal experience because it involves in the experiences about bodily autonomy, about power exchange, about trust. And this is important because, again, if AF tells you that men's notion of consent has dramatically changed over the few years because of the feminist movement, and that's the narrative they're trying to push, that is completely false, and we'll show you why. Because the thing is, men knew what consent was since the beginning of time. They knew what consent meant because they knew what it meant for themselves. They understood consent applied to themselves. So now what applied to themselves. What here is the comparative is that the narrative that they're trying to push suggests that feminists have changed the understanding of men, and it's not just consent of others, but just like overall understanding of consent that has been imposed upon to men by the feminist movement. Our narrative is not telling them that they didn't know that what consent existed, or that they're the problem behind sexual assault. It is rather telling men that they always knew about consent. But the reason they didn't apply it to women was A, because they maliciously ignored women's right to consent. Secondly, they willfully ignored people's humanities, the humanity of women, and saw them as lesser. Which is why men always knew about consent and only applied it to themselves. Moving on to a substantive on a point of principle. Firstly, the point of principle here is that the feminist movement advocates for historically marginalized groups whose truth has been suppressed. This means that they have an obligation to tell the truth when others would not. It is true, and it is empirically true, that men have always known consent but have only applied it to themselves and kept it from applying it to others. And examples of this are, firstly, the fear of being taken as a prisoner of war because they were fearful of getting raped in those prison camps, to the extent that men killed themselves to avoid that humiliation. Secondly, this looks like historical and mythical fear of mythical creatures like succubi, which is a female mythical creature that would come and rape men in their sleep. Thirdly, this looks like gay panic and trans panic. What is that about? It is about men feeling that they would be treated the way they treat other people. That is an inherent way that men do understand consent and what is at stake. So it is empirically true, and it is a non-contingent point of principle that men have always cared, however, have suppress the truth, which is why the feminist movement needs to bring this higher truth out. Secondly, the second point of principle here is that the feminist movement just have a higher obligation to help and to advocate women and gender minorities and sexual assault victims, irrespective of what gender identity they come from. And so this makes them the most important stakeholder in this debate, and so it outweighs any of the fringe practical benefits that side affirmative might try to claim, which means that if we prove to you that AF's narrative and AF's messaging is horrible for women and gender minorities and horrible for sexual assault victims, not only do we win this debate, we also win this principle clash. Now, my second point is substantive, is how these messages are internalized. To understand this, the first question is, how do men actually internalize this narrative? In their world, what new rules actually insist? Note that the AF's best case on their side of the bench is that men will now suddenly be like, oh, I did not know about this. Oh, this was never something that crossed my mind. Oh, thank you, feminist movement. Thank you for telling me that consent is a thing. And so I guess I will change now, which is completely untrue, and that is what their best case actually looks like. And note how men actually internalize this. Firstly, they internalize this message and weaponize it against the feminist movement. This looks like just calling them stupid, or the fact that the feminist movement implies that they did not know anything about consent and they were supposed to be told this stuff by women, and the feminist movement implies that they are men as inherently are stupid or could not understand this, which makes them feel offended, which is why narratives like, oh, this is too much feminism, I guess you just have to sign contracts to sleep with women now, and all of that come along because men feel that they have another narrative being pushed upon them where they feel that they've been told that they're dumb and they don't understand that. However, on our side of the world, what you get under willful ignorance, the claim here is not that there would be a perfect understanding amongst all men, but the claim here that it would be more receptive and better than the comparative itself. And this is because of three reasons. Firstly, we can link these experiences and our narrative back to empathetical experiences.
I think to say that consent has always been innately known by everyone in the world is extremely uncharitable characterization proposed by opposition. Why is this? We understand that consent has dramatically changed, not just from the understanding of men, but from the understanding of women as well. Because consent used to just be things like just saying yes or agreeing to sex. But in fact, what has now been perpetuated is that the fact that consent goes beyond this, right? It's no longer just verbal consent, but now understanding things like non-verbal consent. For example, when a woman perhaps winces during sex, or for example, when a woman says that they want to have sex in the beginning and then doesn't want to in the future, like later on. Or perhaps maybe in circumstances where a woman might be engaged in alcoholism and things like that, that needs to be important. Why? Even this idea of consent is something I, as a female, hadn't known, because initially what was perpetuated was that consent was just verbal, right? And therefore, we need to care more. We agree with the fact that it's important for us to push the narrative that it's no longer just about, assault. It's about learning how to engage in healthy sex, right? So it doesn't push this idea that as long as you don't have sex with someone who's against their will, that it's okay. But it's more of understanding that it's important to engage in healthy sex. And I'm going to show it to you why it's important in terms of educating men. Firstly, panel, if I can prove to you that our side can one, increase the willingness of men to cooperate, two, be part of the conversation, and three, be encouraged to police one another, we win this debate. First on the idea of like, how do we actually increase the willingness of men to cooperate? Firstly, let's just look at the characterization of new rules and willful ignorance. The new rules narrative proposes that men's understanding of consent to sex has radically changed as a result of feminist activism. This means that we're trying to propose this idea that men can and should be part of the activism, and that men are capable of change, and that there are men who may actually be facing sexual assault as well, and therefore they need to be included in the conversation. What does the willful ignorance do? And we see that very clearly in their first negative speaker, that they're proposing that men has always been largely aware, therefore it's a very extreme and radical view that basically says that all men are trash, right? That all men are capable of this sexual assault, that all men have and probably will engage with these sexual assault cases. And that's really very bad, because that pushes all of these men to far away, because now they're not being included. The characterization given to us by side of the opposition is that, men knew what consent meant, and that the feminist movement is changing the consent of men, and it's the fact that they always knew they're pushing for the malicious right to consent, and they need to understand that they're lesser and things like that. We tell you that that's a very harmful narrative, because you're then pushing the men, understanding that there's a spectrum of men that currently exists within society. Maybe on the far right, you have men who hate women, and on the far left, you have really feminist men. What you're now doing on their proposition is excluding this entire scale of men that actually exist within society. Furthermore, the intersectionality within the center, where perhaps you have men who are not so sure about what sexual assault really is, or and things like that. For example, you're looking at youth boys, right? Like young kids, or for example, youth in high school. Now, what you're doing is you're pushing these people away because of this narrative that you're pushing that all men are bad. What does this look like in terms of feminist movement? They tell us that they want to make sure that these feminist movements actually gain traction. Now, what's happening is that now, currently, the feminist movement has occurred a lot of support from women. What it's currently lacking is the support from men. Why is this so? It's because of the willful ignorance that's been perpetuated currently within our society, that all men are bad. What does this look like? It looks like women's marches not having a substantial amount of men who are actually participating. One, because they're in fear that other men within their life are probably going to hate them, because noting that a lot of men nowadays, because of the radical views of certain feminist movements, what they're being painted is that now they're painting women as enemies, right? Because now they're trying to push this narrative that all sexual assault is done by men. Therefore, they're very unlikely to even join all of these women's marches, right? They're very unlikely to do that. Even when we see during the Women's and Gender Minorities meeting, there was a very low level or number of men who are actually participating in this conversation in fear that, one, they're gonna get attacked, and who would want to sit there getting attacked by all of these things, but also by the fact that now women themselves are not unlikely to even encourage their male friends, their male counterparts who can and will be part of this conversation. Noting as well that during the women and gender minorities, the men who could actually have been included are men who are intelligent, the men who are debating for things like women's rights, but they are now not currently being part of the conversation because of this ostracizing that women are doing with the willful ignorance movement. Now, furthermore, when we're looking at sexual assault, it's important to understand that it's more than just like women who are facing sexual assault. Men are also facing this sexual assault, meaning that now what's going to happen with things like sexual assault conversations or sexual assault movements, men are not going to want, or men are going to fear that they're not allowed to actually be part of this conversation because, they're being painted as the perpetrators, they're being painted as things. So therefore, they're less unlikely to even talk about these things. And it's important for us to understand that we don't want to just decrease sexual assault amongst women, we want to decrease sexual assault altogether. Secondly, they give us this mechanism that men have always known about consent because they're scared of assault. It does not mean that consent has been something that society has told men what they need to get. So for example, ideas of marriage as consent, right? a lot of men nowadays think that, being in a relationship means that you can do whatever you want to your girlfriend, or that your girlfriend doesn't have a right to say that she doesn't want to have sex with you today, right? What is happening, panel, is that it's important for us to understand that these ideas of consent are extremely complex, meaning that the more time we have for these men to be actually part of this conversation, the more likely we are to educate and to change these mindsets, knowing that they've given us that these mindsets are historical, these mindsets are very difficult to eradicate, and therefore we actually need them to be part of this conversation very largely, right? And because men now are being told that they don't need to do it, there's very little chance for it to be changed. But also, right, they give us this idea of your uncle perhaps, right, going against Me Too movement. Notice, panel, that in that sort of circumstances, a woman calling against their uncle for doing this is very unlikely to let this uncle to actually change their minds. What's more likely is when the father of the household, where other men actually also go against these narratives, right? It shows, one, that these men who are now hateful of women are not majority of the people that actually believe the conversations about sexual narratives, but generally other people and other men are also part of this conversation. They're more likely, right, not to want to boast to their friends about all of these things, or more likely to know that within their friend or male friend groups like fraternities and things like that, that these narratives aren't going to be pushed. And this is why we need to make sure that men are part of the conversation, and we cannot willfully ignore them from this narratives and this activism.
Cool, I thank second affirmative for that speech. We're now to call upon second negative to continue the negative team's case. Here, here.
I served as the WGM officer of the Australian Debating Council for 2 consecutive years. If there was a feminist card to be carrying, I would be physically carrying it right now. I'm also multiple times over a victim of sexual exploitation and violence, and I personally would be extremely offended if feminist movements and feminists that I trusted, that I looked up to, that I engaged in discourse with, suggested that because of their valiant efforts over, I guess the immediacy or even just the last few years, charitably interpreting what timescale this has taken place on, that they have valiantly educated men and established the new rules of consent. Because the implication there is that those rules did not apply when I was was 14 or when I was 19 or on any of those other instances that they did not apply, that they were not universal. When I personally know that they were. Your sense of bodily autonomy, your right to say who does what and when and where and how and whether you enjoy it and whether you want them to stop is a fundamental part of your humanity. And we tell you that men intimately understand this. This is not a problem of men not understanding what it means to have your bodily autonomy, honestly in a variety of non-sexual contexts, disrespected, but including in sexual contexts. Men, for instance, fear trans women or fear gay men because they are afraid that they will do to them what they have seen done to women. They know what it means to have your consent violated. We tell them that they need to extend that consideration to women as well. There are two questions to ask in this speech. Firstly, on exactly what the comparative is in this debate, and secondly, on how these narratives are received by men, by victims. Moving on. What is the comparative in this debate? The first thing I can say here is the easiest way to break this down on the kind of nature and importance of consent is these guys break it down on the axis of time, which is they say that, well, we now have a better understanding of how consent works innately. We say that no, this is a fundamental human concept. It is a part of your humanity. It is something that everybody intuitively understands, and that some people have abrogated for instance, being socially disempowered or economically disempowered or physically disempowered, right? And we suggest that we simply extend that along the axis of gender and not along the axis of time. That is what we explain. Now, we explain that men have always known this. They have just refused to extend that set of rights to women because of, for instance, societal narratives and conditioning, which, by the way, informing men of the ways, especially if they're a feminist men, as this team suggests, informing men of the ways that societal narratives have harmed them and have coerced them into beliefs that they did not otherwise aligning with their values has been pretty successful. Has been like when you explain to men that like them not wanting to talk to their friends all the time and therefore having terrible mental health is a result of toxic masculinity, and that it is okay to talk to their friends, and no, it was not their fault that they had that belief in the first place, but they need to change for their own well-being and the well-being of others. They tend to interpret that quite well. We'll talk more about interpretation later. But the second thing is that, well, they have displaced this right from men because of their economic and socio-political disempowerment. The way that this works is this is a fundamental human trait. It is a fundamental human right. And as at many other points during human history, we have selected a group of people. We have taken their humanity away. We do this to other races of people. We do this to other classes of people. And men continue to do it to women. The second thing to understand with respect to the comparative is just to ask the question of whether men understand. We explain two things. We explain, one, just empirically everybody does, because we explain that sexual consent and the importance of sexual consent is about fundamental concepts that apply to everybody's lives. Things like having your trust giving your trust and having it violated or having it respected. Things like knowing acutely that somebody has more power over you and being anxious about that. Even things like your bodily autonomy. These are values that are reflected in a bunch of other ways, like people, for instance, the amount of medical consent that you have to go through before a doctor or a nurse is allowed to touch you or stick you with a needle, because what goes on in your body is something that is so proximate to your humanity and to your experience that we allow you to control it and not anybody else. Secondly, we just explain empirically that men deeply fear, for instance, being either raped by other men or of the narratives of their sexual subjugation of women being reversed. It looks like gay panic. It looks like intense fear of being taken prisoner or going to prison. I cannot count the amount of time that my male friends have had like a shifty eye while they make jokes about dropping the soap in prison, because they genuinely do feel that men will do to them what men are happy to do to women. Let's secondly in this speech talk about how these narratives are received. This is the affirmative win condition. They say, well, we will get more male participation in sexual assault discourse, and therefore reduce the instances of those assaults occurring. Why does this not occur? The first question to ask is, will men opt into this narrative? First note that I'll make here is this is quite literally an attempt at co-opting a common anti-Me Too narrative of the feminists have changed the rule, like the sexual playbook. They have changed the rules of consent, and now we must abide or risk being cancelled. That is perpetuated by conservative media, that is perpetuated by shock jobs, and that is overwhelmingly and self-interestedly bought into by actors like actual rapists and their apologists to say that, well, I didn't know, these crazy feminists have changed the rules. They do not go, I didn't know, and now I will change my behavior. They go, I am right, I didn't, and these are the new rules. I don't want to follow them. No, so this is to say that even if they prove that men can opt in, they actually need to prove more than that. They need to prove that men opt into the good version of the narrative and not the bad version of the narrative. And they often have an incentive to to buy into the the bad version of the narrative. Because one, if they are not feminists, which for instance enormous amounts of men are not under kind of the direct control of a feminist movement. We explain this and argue that it varies incredibly widely across the world, which is where this debate fundamentally takes place. And second, because it hits them in their sense of self. For example, if they know that they've done something kind of dodgy, which loads of men have, they're also an incentive to reject this narrative because they were fine by the old rules and now they're committing a foul under the new rules. If you were like spear tackling people and all of a sudden your sport made it illegal to spear tackle people, you might be a bit upset about that. It might be a little bit difficult for you to accept the new rules there. Second thing to say here is that to the extent that men opt in, it's actually unclear where this argument goes practically. Firstly, because this debate and the kind of affirmative narrative is implied to kind of like materialize. That is to say, the understanding of consent has radically changed because of the actions of feminists. So it is unclear exactly what the delta here is. But secondly, probably more directly, there are a ton of other incentives to make sure that good sex ed occurs. For instance, it is often schools that deal with the immediate risk of the physical and emotional fallout when violations of consent occur. Like they are literally the ones that have to provide the counselors. They are literally the ones that have to swap classes around if two kids get into a horrible situation with one another. They are the ones that have to do all of those things. So to the extent that child psychology and that sexual psychology has evolved, usually have an incentive to do those things, which is why in the jurisdictions that are not incredibly puritanical with how they view sex, they do. The third thing to say here is do men, the third thing to say here is just ask yourself, do men successfully convince other men with the new rules conversation? Can you actually visualize a conversation along these lines occurring in a locker room or in a boys' school or in a workplace and say, hey man, you shouldn't do that. The feminists have changed the rules now. The rules are different now. We must respect women. How does that work? We, on the other hand, and secondly under this point, explain why men will engage with our narrative. The first thing is that we link it back to their own experiences. We emphasize their common humanity with women and say that they simply must extend the same courtesy to them. We say, how would you feel? These guys, by the way, said that we have a new understanding of consent that is like, if your partner is like wincing or in pain, you should stop. Do you think men enjoy having painful sex? Do you think that they do not want to stop if they are in pain and it no longer feels good to them? They absolutely do. They have so much sexual autonomy to do whatever the fuck they want in those situations. They absolutely do stop if they feel like the dick's gonna break or something like that. They do not subject themselves overwhelmingly to sexual discomfort when they do not want to. So they also understand intuitively those things. The second thing we say is that this just backs them into a corner with respect to misogyny. When you confront them with this narrative and you say, women are people too, you are a person, you care about this, please extend this courtesy to women, either they are forced to go, okay, this is uncomfortable, but I will accept this, or they have to say, yeah, but women are different for some reason. Outs misogynist, forces them into a corner, forces them to confront their beliefs. I explained in my introduction why exactly this is so bad, why this is so bad, Victim. It's incredibly demoralizing, both for women and for men, to have a movement tell you that your historic child sex abuse didn't matter because the rules are different now than they were back then. They were always the same.
I thank second negative for that speech. Call upon third affirmative to conclude affirmative team's case. Here you go.
Notice that the reason that they tell you that their side is going to be effective is because you shame men and you tell them that they view women as subhuman and therefore they have to change the way that they consider consent. that actually tells you exactly why their narrative is so harmful. Because now you've gone to a group of men and you say, you view women as subhuman, you are a terrible person, you hate women. And that just confirms in the minds of all the conservatives that feminists hate men, that feminists are shaming men, that feminists are telling you that you're a terrible human being. And rather than shaming men into acting in the way you liked, you then shamed men into doing things that were really defensive. Like saying, feminists hate men, or having conservative men go out and really publicly do things, like say that the feminist movement was out to get you and it was out to take your rights away. Notice at that point, it doesn't even matter if we don't prove that men opt into our narrative, because there is an active harm of their narrative. Because even if you believe that conservative men would never abide by laws like consent, they were still watched by men who were more moderate, because more moderate men did watch people like, Jordan Peterson or someone like that. And at the point at which he is out there saying feminists hate you, you are much more likely to believe that, compared to where there was the idea that there is a new set of rules that are being negotiated in the new types of sexual encounters that we're having in a world that views sex quite differently to the way that it did in the past. And that was something that men considered they were much more likely to be able to be a part of, because they perceived sex as something that was changing. Because in our world, the way we engaged in sex was not the same now as it used to be, and it would not be the same in the future. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on how, on the principled idea of how this forces the feminist movement to engage in sexual assault, and then secondly, on how this interacts, how men interact with this narrative. Firstly then, let's deal with the feminist movement, because this is their main push here on the principle. Essentially, what they tell you is that there's a principled need to expose what the truth is. I think the first thing to note here is this: obviously it relies on this narrative not being something that is true. A couple of responses to this, because the reason they give you is that men have always understood consent for themselves, which means that they must have understood what consent was. I think that men understanding what it was to feel violated and to feel pain did not mean that they understood consent, given that what we understood as consent was something that was societally constructed, because society told you what consent was at any point in time. Because in the past, society told men that consent was that they had gotten married to someone, and that meant that they could do whatever they wanted in that situation, or that consent was that they were stronger, or that consent was something else. And I think that what that does is it demonstrates to you that the way that men interacted with consent has been something that has been informed by society. It has been something that's been informed by the historical period in which this has taken place. And obviously, this is not to say that the feminist movement is now going, well, that wasn't sexual assault, because they still recognize the harm that has been done to women. But instead, it's locating that the responsibility for that comes from the societal sexist norms of the time that told you that women's consent was not important, that told men that it was not something that they had to care about. Obviously, at that point, the norms of of what consent was are actually things that have changed over time. They are actually things that have been informed by the feminist movement and by the way that has happened. That has occurred for both men and for women, in the sorts of consent they feel enabled to show, the situations in which they feel capable of doing things like saying no. But I think secondly, the reason why we win on this point, actually, flipping what they say, is because we proved to you from first to almost no response that we actually are able to get better education on this. That was because now feminist movements are seen as much more willing to interact with groups like governments, like other lobbying groups, to decide what these new rules are. And I think that what that does is it means that whereas on their world, schools are more likely to be schools who already don't want to provide sexual assault training, sexual consent training, things like that, have a way to cop out. They can be like, well, the feminist movement says that men understand what sexual assault is and what consent is. Therefore, we don't really need to teach it. That's something that's can come in through other stuff. It can be implicit. We can just tell them to see women as human, and therefore that will fix the problem, rather than saying we need to actually teach children what consent looks like. I think this gets better on our side, because firstly, there is the idea that you actually need to update the rules that constitute what consent is. That it can't just be a single yes. It has to be a yes at every point. What different parts of sex actually require you to have consent, rather than it just being one thing that you did once. And I thought that what that meant was, it was one, easier for different institutions to start implementing these sorts of things, but also that they had a way to do it, a roadmap that was provided to them that did not allow them to cop out. What that meant was that women as well as men receive more of this education from a younger age. And I think that if you care about bodily autonomy and the principle that is pushed at Connor, we actually make that better. Because at the point at which you as a young girl do not know what you're entitled to say no to, you are in a much worse position when it comes to any form of sexual encounter. At the point at which you are told that actually you get to, you should be able to have consent at every step of the journey. You are much more enabled and you are much more able to have the self-knowledge that allowed you to claim control over your body. Even at the point at which you were still facing sexual assault from men, I think that at the point at which we provided you at least knowledge to recognize what had happened to you, to see that it was sexual assault, that it was not just something that happened, that was a principled win on our side of the house. But equally notice that this changed behaviours into the future and made things so much better for women in the long run. Okay, nextly then, how do men interact with this narrative and how does it impact on support? So I think the first thing to say here is that when they tell you that men are going to reject this narrative because they're not going to opt in, I think that we actually have two pathways to victory that are separate at this point. Firstly, we can prove to you that there is a harm to their narrative that is separate. So we believe that even if we don't opt in on our side, you still get more of a harm on their side. But secondly, I'm going to prove to you why you get more of an opt-in. Okay, firstly then, why do we think there's a harm that exists on their side? What they tell you here about the willful ignorance narrative is that you can shame men into it and you can draw back onto men's own understanding. I think the first thing to say here is that this shows how relatively progressive men or relatively moderate men actually can easily avoid this sort of narrative. They can say things like, oh, but I already actually see women as human, so I guess that I already understand what consent is, right? Which means that they're less likely to do things like educate themselves, less likely to do things like listen to female friends when they say, actually you should have asked before you had penetrative sex without a condom or something like that. That was something that breached my consent. But they're likely to be like, oh, no, but I understand what consent is because, I'm not being ignorant, I've overcome the willful ignorance, rather than I'm updating myself on the new rules. I think that makes it really bad for that group. But secondly, I think this is particularly bad in conservative groups because I think that on two levels. Firstly, because I think that women are less likely to buy into this narrative because you're more likely to be like, oh, but I actually think some of my male friends are really nice. I think my male partner views me as a human. I think therefore he probably has an understanding of this, which means that you're less likely to want to support a sort of narrative that seems to be shaming them around you. But secondly, I literally just think that at the point at which you buy their stuff about shaming men into this, you see that it's so easy to view these people view the feminist movement as man-hating, as something that is not about actually progressing society, but rather about shaming men, which sticks men onto the defensive and makes them so much less likely to actually do this. That worsens the locker room banter that they wanted to tell you about. But I also think this is then worse for gender diverse victims because now that you're saying that men are ignoring this narrative, you're not saying that anyone can commit sexual assault. You're not saying that sexual assault is something that is changing and consent is something that's changing, and therefore you actually devalidate those sorts of experiences because you make it more like, oh well, if men are the ones who are ignoring this, then why has this man been the one who has been sexually assaulted? I think that's worse on their own metric. But then let's deal with the next way we win this point, or why we are more likely to get people to opt in. I think the first thing to say here is that it seems much more dialectic. What they tell you about this is that men are made to feel stupid, but I think this is actually just wrong because you're saying that everybody needs education on these new rules, that there are new rules that everybody has to learn together. That's women, that's men, and that means that you're less likely to feel targeted by this and much more likely it's an inclusive process that you are a part of. And I think that then, secondly, you're less likely to see this as such of a radical change because understandings of sex are things that are changing in our current world as well. So it probably makes sense to a lot of men that our understandings of consent need to change along with the sexual experiences that they're engaging in, the types of sex that they're engaging in. And I think they're less likely to see this then as a change specifically enacted by feminists, but more likely to see it as something that comes along with the changing of the world in future and something that gets better. Weigh this off. We are reducing the harm that accrues to women into the future because we needed to target men when this was a problem perpetuated majoritarily by men. That was the point at which we were actually able to stop people from experiencing these horrific things. That was the most important harm in this debate. So proud to propose.
Cool, I thank third F for that speech. We'll now call upon third neg to conclude this debate. Here.
be very clear what the difference between the two sides in this debate is. Side affirmative is a side that says consent is a radical new concept pushed by the feminist movement, and side negative says that consent is a basic human right that has always applied to everyone and that will always apply to everyone. This is the difference between these two sides, and this is why people are far more willing to engage on our side, why people are far more likely to take this message seriously on our side, and why our side has won this debate. A few things in this speech. First of all, which side gets more discussion of sexual assault and the importance of consent, and second of all, which gets better discussion of sexual assault and consent. The first push we hear from opposition is that, well, men are far less likely to engage in the feminist movement and discussions of consent because they feel like they've been put on the defensive. This is quite a strange push from opposition, because the first response here is, well, the only men who would feel like they're being put on the defensive or feel like they're being attacked are the ones who have violated consent in the past. If you haven't violated consent and you haven't sexually assaulted someone, there's no reason you'd feel like you're on the defensive. And to the extent that people feel defensive, or to the extent people feel shamed by this message, we think that's fine. We would shame these people. This is something that we would entirely support. And second of all, we think even if just the general male population feels kind of defensive, we think that's a good thing. We think this just shows it's forcing people to confront issues of consent that they've otherwise ignored, forcing them to confront the fact that they've viewed women as less than human, and forcing them to confront the fact that the society that they're in and the norms that operate in that society are broken. If people are defensive, if people are uncomfortable, that is a good thing, because that means we're getting change. If they're the side that lets people stay comfortable in a side that is massively high rates of sexual assault, that means they're a side that doesn't get enough change. We're the side that gets change. It's fine if people feel uncomfortable as a result. But third of all, we tell you that people are that men are probably far less likely to feel on the defensive on our side, because we provide a narrative that presents consent as a basic human right. This means that it's not a political or a radical concept pushed by the feminist movement, but something that has always existed and will always exist. This means there's a significantly lower barrier to entry. People are far less likely to be combative, and are far more likely to self-police this idea, because we present consent as something that is innate. We force people to be empathetic when dealing with issues of consent. This means they're far more likely to self-police when there's not always someone over their shoulder. They're far more likely to have those difficult conversations with their friends, and they're far more likely to just be, in general, a better human being. Okay, evidently, even if men are more defensive on their side of the house, that just means we're getting change. We think it's incredibly unlikely that they're going to be defensive. The next push we hear from opposition is, well, people are going to feel like the feminist movement is ostracizing them, and therefore, as a whole, that they're not going to enter the feminist movement and engage in this kind of discourse. The first response here is we tell you this is largely symmetrical, because affirmative is a side that says, the current rulebook is broken and the feminist movement needs to tear it up and write it again. That's probably quite combative for both sides of the house. The kinds of stakeholders that would feel like they're being victimized are probably feeling victimized on either side of the house. But second of all, we say that our burden of entry, our barrier of entry, is a far lower one, because we're a side that literally just says consent is a basic human right. We think when that applies to everyone in society, it is significantly easier for you to opt in. But the second response to this material is that, well, we think there's a significant amount of external factors that actually inform whether or not you join the feminist movement or not. That can just be if you've been raised in a progressive country or a progressive household. Well, second of all, maybe if you just see women as people, we think that is the kind of barrier to entry that is going to be deciding whether or not people are engaging in this kind of discourse. And perhaps sexual assault isn't the main, in fact, sexual assault and discussions of consent perhaps aren't the largest one. Okay, let's say you assume that men actually are far more likely to engage in the feminist movement on their side of the house. Why does that not win them debate, and why shouldn't we actually care about this? This is because for them to do that, you have to ignore historic assault of people who've been victimized by social norms instead of by actual people. They devalue the traumatic experiences that those people have had to suffer, and they, devalue the nature of their experience as a whole. This means that people who've been sexually assaulted, that are perhaps the most vulnerable, and that need the most from the feminist movement, are now being ostracized. They probably have no other place to, feel safe in society, and now the movement is telling them that their experience is invalid. So even if their side says you get more men engaging in the feminist movement, that is at the opportunity cost of an incredibly vulnerable stakeholder, one that we would protect, one that we ought protect, one that is the most important to protect. Opposition's kind of push here in response is that, well, we don't actually ignore the historic forms of assault because we're putting it on social norms as opposed to individuals. But we tell you, by moving the blame away from the perpetrators of sexual assault, you devalue the individual experience of each victim. You say that the victims of sexual assault can't feel angry at the people who assaulted them, can't feel angry at the people who violated their consent, and instead it is a social norm. That is incredibly dehumanizing and devalues the extent which their experiences as a human should be cared about. Okay, clearly we are the side that gets more discussion on sexual assault because we frame this as a human right and not a political or a radical issue. far easier to opt in on our side of the house. Okay, next issue here on why we get better discussion. Note that this is probably a more important issue in this debate, because if opposition manages to prove that they get more discussion of sexual assault, but it is a bad kind of discussion, it's unclear why that would win the debate. Okay, a few things here. The first push from opposition, and the largest push from opposition, is that, well, we get more nuanced discussions of the development of consent when people feel like they need to be educated on this issue. I guess the main response here is it is unclear what the change from affirmative is, because we're not a side that says consent isn't important, we're a side that says consent is a fundamental human right. And this means that the kinds of change that they're trying to get isn't on understanding of consent, but understanding on the expression of consent, and we're the side probably caters to that to a significantly large extent. Why is this the case? Because first of all, when we put consent as a basic human right, people are going to be far more willing to be empathetic to the idea of violating consent and therefore self-police. When it's framed as a new rule that they may or may not have to opt into because it's been pushed by, I don't know, like a radical or new movement, it's far less likely that they're going to be self-policing in this way and engaging in the comparative. And we tell you that secondly, because this is an issue that I think, like as I said before, empathetic issue, far more likely to self-police. But it's also way easier to have those kinds of discussions with your friends in your workplace and with like I don't know, like other men. Because if it's framed as a social norm as opposed to being a political issue, it's far easier to have that kind of discussion of education. To say, I don't know, what is the correct thing to do here, what is the incorrect thing to do here? Okay, the next push we hear from and I guess the second line of response here is that, well, even if you believe that opposition is going to get more nuanced discussion, that discussion probably isn't reaching the people who kind of need to hear it, because the people who are perpetrating sexual violence are probably very unlikely to be having an in-depth engagement with the feminist movement and the messages that they're spreading. That is to say, all of the benefit of nuance is probably lost on them, meaning that the benefit to this push is incredibly marginal. In the comparative, we give quite a clear understanding, quite a clear idea of what consent is and why it is important. This means that the people who would only have the surface level engagement on both sides of the house, on our side, are far more likely to take away the critical message of consent, and through self-policing, through empathy, through an understanding of a basic human right, are likely to impose all of the same nuanced understandings upon themselves. Okay, clearly we appeal to more people and have a higher quality discussion. But the next push from opposition is that, well, the education system as a whole is going to mean that people feel far less compelled to be educated. Three responses here. First of all, we think if we are people are far less likely to be educated if, I guess, consent is being framed as new rules, because this means that they see consent as an extra thing that they may have to opt into. If we say that this is something that you've been violating, this is a basic human right and a fundamental violation of human decency, people are far more likely to be compelled to understand it. And the second thing to say here is that probably if you are told consent is a universal human right and you don't understand consent to the extent that you think it's necessary or the extent that we need, it's probably far more compelling for these people to get educated, because it's easier to have a conversation about consent, it's easier to ask people about it, because it is a universal human right. On this issue of schools, we tell you schools on either side of the house have a vested interest in educating their children, because first of all, as we told you, they probably have to deal with the fallout of violations of consent, and second of all, people probably just want to protect their children from violations of consent anyways, so schools have quite a large vested interest on being quite good educators of this kind of notion. At the end of the speech, it should be incredibly clear we get more people engaging with narratives of consent, and the kinds of narratives they engage in are significantly more productive on our side of the house. So proud to get it.